Hot Takes. Alright! Hello, everybody. I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and it's that time again, where we gather around the campfire. Not singing our campfire songs as a SpongeBob thing. Our thing is we regale each other with hot takes concerning our favorite games. And this go around, it's Final Fantasy XIV's time to shine. I got count 'em, 5 hot takes, piping off the oven, ready for our consumption. And let's just get right on into it, shall we? And we're just gonna start, we're gonna rip it with this delectable hot take. We have at the Tater Toddy, great, now I'm hungry, cooking up post ARR, A Realm Reborn is good. No. Okay, moving on. Okay, I kid. I think A Realm Reborn has some really great moments to it. The introduction of Midgard Soma, the prelude for Heavensward, the entire finale part with the Sultana. In the moment, those elements were really good. I also quite like the Shiva stuff that we got there. There's giant swaths of it, though, that I think are just wholly and mostly uninteresting, and they feel like time-paddy stuff. It's world building, don't get me wrong, it's important, especially stuff like Leviathan and all that. But is it that interesting? Not particularly. Is it good that we get development and a bunch of foreshadowing for stuff like Yugiri and the Doman refugees? Absolutely. Is it important we're developing the dynamic between Limsala, Minsa, and the Beast Tribe? Sure, all that stuff does come back. Could it have been told way better? Absolutely. And if there's any part of Final Fantasy XIV that I would be in favor of them just completely redoing or going at it again with a red marker and calling a lot of it, it would be the post-A Realm Reborn era. Because that's where I tend to find to be one of the biggest falling off points for a bunch of new players. They beat A Realm Reborn, they beat that base story. They're like, okay, maybe not the best, but it was quite good, or I enjoyed that. I'm ready to get into Heavensward. And then you have this giant patch wall where you're gaining little experience. It's all just level 50 quests. And you have this giant chunk of quests you have to do. Now also included are the Crystal Tower raids before you can get to Heavensward, which is the thing that gets hyped up the most. And it can be a real gut punch for a lot of people out there, understandably so, because they want to get to the really good stuff, because I think a lot of us can agree that the jump in quality, storytelling-wise, aesthetic-wise, in pretty much every avenue, including voice acting, for the most part, gets infinitely better the moment Heavensward proper actually starts. That's a pro for Heavensward, but we do kind of just default to, it gets better after 30 hours, that old debate, that old argument, that's just not really conducive to a new player experience, and I think something should be ironed out, something should be renovated in that regard. I think it does have its pros, it does have its moments where it shines, but they're too few and far between in my opinion. Next up, we have at Fubuki the Icy King, who says they should have a unique progression for people that want to do the non-combat jobs. Like maybe you can progress by getting high ratings, or your maid equipment was used to clear a dungeon. It's an interesting suggestion. It's one of those forever problems a lot of MMORPGs run into at some point, is how do we make crafting and gathering more interesting and stuff like that. World of Warcraft has had this issue since time immemorial. Final Fantasy XIV, I think for the most part, has done a pretty good job of it. It's a system where you either like it or hate it, but you can absolutely dump a bunch of time into it if you want, and there is quite a bit of content there. I do think it could use a bit of a facelift, and maybe we get that with something like Cosmic Exploration. That is to wait and see, pretty much. We have to wait and see what that content will look like. No system will ever be perfect, and I think if you search for a system and you demand perfection, you're left with like not much left, because you'll never really find perfection when it comes to an MMO system. There'll always be a hiccup, there'll always be a pain point. But I think it could be cool to at least gain some benefit if your gear could be used by other players. You don't want a system that some way, some shape or form could be used for stalking and stuff like that. But some moniker saying, hey, that piece of gear you made, someone cleared an ultimate with it. And like maybe you get maybe a token. I think just giving some scripts could be rather boring. Maybe that could be an extra resource you get. Maybe like a badge system could be interesting. Like you're a Boy Scout or something, it's like you get the badge for saying, I made gear that was used in an ultimate. Doesn't have to be used for anything, just like a list of achievements essentially. I think something like that could be cool. Wouldn't be my highest priority for a system like this, but I think it has potential to be rather interesting. interesting. I don't know if I would argue for leaderboards in a system like that, as we saw kind of the effect of similar systems like that back in Ishgard Restoration, where you'll just have a bunch of people who stay up all night, all day, just crafting and doing stuff like that. Maybe you could have stuff that's a bit more local, like based on your specific home server. I don't know, it's something interesting to think about. I don't think the way to improve crafting and gathering would be entirely done by any one system, but a couple of new systems possibly working together. And maybe it wouldn't require all that much, just a few very simple things to bolster the experience. Like, if you make a piece of gear, then on that piece of gear in the item description, it says the name of the character who actually made it. I think World of Warcraft has a system kind of like that nowadays. Just something cool, right? It doesn't amount to much, just something cool to essentially carve your name into that piece of gear. Next up, we have at Black Velvet 98, who says, the Nier raids are top tier. The ones that don't like it are probably the ones that want to fly through Crystal Tower every raid roulette because it's faster and brain dead. Okay, look, I'm not saying they're cooking. I'm just saying a Michelin star is in their near future. For me, I know the Nier raids get quite a lot of flack. I love them. I love each one of them. I think they're all fun. I love the rewards from it. It's my favorite glamour in the entire game. I love the companions you get. I just love Nier. It's one of my favorite franchises in all of gaming. I am a Nier stan, I'm a Nier fan, I'm a Nier fanatic. And I have consistently over the last few years put Nier Automata in the #1 slot for me for my favorite game of all time. So of course a raid in one of my favorite MMORPGs, which is also one of my favorite games of all time, that does a crossover event with my other favorite game of all time, of course I'm going to like it. And I also quite like the mechanics in the raids. They're cool, they're fun, I like them. I love the music blaring in my ear. I'm a fan. Having said that, I do kind of groan every time it pops up in my roulette. One, because I got most of the glamour that I actually want out of it already. But two, when you design a system like a roulette, where it is the idea that I'm supposed to grind this every day, or that I can, at some point, I will cross over the line, a threshold if you will, where I will stop caring that much about how interesting and complex the systems are in that fight or in that raid, and I just want it done as fast as humanly possible, because it feels like a chore to me. If you have some kind of, I'm going to use that word, homogenization in terms of the length and difficulty of all these different raids, then sure, I don't mind having a nice variety there. But if I'm going to have to do a chore each day, or at least I'm incentivized to do a chore each day, and you give me options where it's like this group of raids can be done in like 10 minutes and just using your big toe, and this other one will take you about 30 to 40, and you gotta really hope you don't have an entire party of people that are sharing 5 brain cells among all of them. Well, if I am going to pick which one of those two groups I'm gonna want to do each day for the rewards, it's gonna be the one that's easiest, because MMORPGs and gamers on the whole, more often than not, when you give them the option, go the path of least resistance. We have seen this time immemorial when it comes to online gaming. So while I love the Nier raids, I understand why a lot of people just want to do the Crystal Tower raids, because they're faster. And you get that chore because you've done these raids, at this point, possibly hundreds of times. Or if not hundreds, you're nearing that number. It's not new, fresh, and interesting. You've done it before. They all start to feel the same to you. I understand why some people will want the easier and far quicker option. And I don't even think necessarily that it's because it's easier. It's simply because it's quicker. Time is valuable for a lot of people. And if they're there for the same exact reward, or at least mostly, they're gonna want the thing that's most efficient. That's just how online gamers largely behave. You may be the exception. I'm not talking about this commenter here, right? I'm talking about like the general you here. You may be the specific exception, but generally speaking, that is how most people operate. And now we come to the final two. And these final two are rather spicy, and I saved them for the end because we're gonna go big picture here. And you know what? We're gonna rip it with this first one by @Vagrant2863. Who says they should burn the game down again and start over. All games need an ending. I have seen this take in my comments for a long time now, especially with Dawntrail, and the mixed reception that a lot of people have had to the story of Dawntrail. Because when you finish a giant narrative arc like the Hydaelyn and Zodiac arc, if you continue it, and you do a new story and it's immediately well received, people will be fine with it. But if it starts to falter, or if there's a perceived giant dip off a cliff in terms of quality, people will say, you should have just ended this. It's like watching The Simpsons malform into whatever abomination it has become over the last, at this point, like 20 years, where it kind of feels you should have just taken this out behind the woodshed and shot it, put it out of its misery. And I know Vagrant didn't say this in their comment, but I've also seen this, so I'm gonna kind of lump it in, like a polymerization, if you will. People say, Final Fantasy XIV should have ended and we get a new MMO to work on. I understand why people feel that way. I don't think it's the solution you think it is. I don't think Final Fantasy XIV's current issues are necessarily because of some giant rule of storytelling or anything like that. It's philosophical problems that, unless they are addressed, will stagnate and rot over time. I never, ever, ever bought the idea that the quality of Dawntrail's story should be excused simply because it's a new story. It's the beginning of something new. It's the A Realm Reborn. That's not good enough. And I also really fundamentally dislike the notion that something has to be bad simply because it's a beginning. I know there's quite a few games out there, there's quite a few media franchises out there where the beginning is rather slow, rather trotting and uninteresting, but it gets significantly better over time. I get that. That should not be excused. There's a bunch of things out there that have phenomenal beginnings. Fellowship of the Ring, Star Wars Episode 4, to name a couple. Just because something is the start, just because something is the beginning, doesn't mean it can't be good. So I don't excuse the issues of Dawntrail that I have, at least, with it, simply because it's the start of something new. We should not be striving for a Realm Reborn quality in the year 2025, especially when you showed me, back in the days of Shadowbringers, heck, in pretty much every expansion since, that you are fully capable of largely introducing a new section of this world for the first time, for the most part, and have it be interesting, engaging, and emotionally gripping. You've done it before. If you needed more backstory, you could have spent more time in the Endwalker patches introducing the new world conceptually if you needed to. We knew largely not much when it came to the first, and then we got Shadowbringers, and we fell in love with that world, so much so there was a non-insignificant chunk of the player base who didn't want to go back to Eorzea, who didn't want to go back to the source because they were so emotionally invested with the first. And people attribute that, some way, somehow, to the development that it got back in Heavensward patches, with the Warriors of Darkness, that was only really applicable for those characters, and didn't do much to actually develop and flesh out the world outside of it got overtaken by the light, and like Minfilia played a part in stopping that. Buddy, that can be explained in like 5 lines of dialogue, and it kinda was. But the reason Shadowbringers was so good wasn't necessarily because of previous investment in the world of the first, it was because of the work they put in at that time to flesh out and develop that world, to make it emotionally interesting, filled to the brim with characters we genuinely cared about, and emotional struggles and tribulations that we got immediately invested in. Was it perfect? No, that train section was a bit slow, but for the most part, they did a great job with it, and there's no reason that couldn't have been done for the new world. I know some people like it, that's entirely fine. Storytelling and stories overall, and our perception of them and our reception of them overall, is largely subjective. I can only speak for myself here, where I think, and I say, that to me, the quality of world building and storytelling and pacing and emotional investment was vastly subpar in Dawntrail than it had been in previous expansions. And I don't think it's because Dawntrail is the beginning of something new. And the problem is, if you burn the game down and you decide, or at least Square Enix decides to start again, you run into the same exact issue, where you have to develop now an entire new world, or at least a new beginning, and we run into this issue again, where you have to do a beginning well. Just because you're the start of a giant story arc at the beginning is not an excuse for subpar quality. And I think most of the issues I have with Final Fantasy XIV in its current iteration, they're not like impossible to fix. It's content cadence and decision making and storytelling methodologies utilized within Dawntrail. And I think the idea of trying to lump all the blame, just saying, alright, it's an old game, people, what are we gonna do? Hey, they're trying to tell a new story, I think that's doing a disservice to the actual foundational issues Final Fantasy XIV has right now, and the things that are holding it back. This game can have great class design, it can have great job design, because it's had it before. Fight design is really good right now. Visual design, this game is gorgeous. But there's issues with the direction of the game. And if you burn it down, wipe the slate clean, and you start again, you're gonna build up, though, from that same foundation. Even if it's a new world, even if it's a new story, even if it's new characters. Because the same foundational issues exist, and they have to be addressed first. Could some issues be renovated by using a new engine that's not, like, thrown together with string, hope, and bubblegum? Sure. Are those the biggest issues this game faces right now? I genuinely don't believe so. And we're gonna continue this line of thought in the next hot take. We have at worst9347 who says, due to Medion essentially killing off all outside life in the universe, we only have the remaining reflections minus the void to have a story on. And given how Dawntrail took its approach of giving us a quote-unquote break story, a story without the world-ending threats, we will have a formulaic new expansion with a great evil that is somehow strong enough to end reality or at least all life on the world. The Warrior of Light is barely a character from the perspective of the world, given how in Dawntrail they did nothing unless a giant threat is causing trouble, making them a living eraser of problems too big for others to handle, while having no other qualities or insight. Not to mention, given how the Scions are now separated for the most part, no one really wants to hang out with you, and you are just a wanderer without a purpose in the world, since peace is mostly all it is now. And clearly a bandit group or two is of no concern for you, and you would just leave it to other people. If that's the story of a wanderer learning how to deal with not being needed as much anymore, then that could be a nice change of pace. But at the rate the story at least is going, Final Fantasy XIV will be held up by people needing to keep their houses, ERPers, and modders. This goes back to what I was talking about before, the foundational issues. Because to me, in my eyes, some people will view this as a limitation because of the events in Endwalker. It closed off a large section of the cosmos. I don't think you ever needed that, though, to continue to develop and flesh out the story of Final Fantasy XIV. There's plenty of locations, there's plenty of things you can do, not just on the source, but also in the shards, to have plenty of great new set pieces and storylines for a long time. I don't think Endwalker did anything to prevent Final Fantasy XIV from being excellent going into the future. It's just a bunch of things that in this moment, if these trends continue, I can understand why people will lose interest. Because I don't believe the quality that we had before is there anymore. But it can come back. There's plenty of places on the source by itself that we could explore, flesh out, you could develop whole expansions and interesting stories about. And this idea that, well, what's the threat gonna be? Because the Warrior of Light is this, like, triple S tier level powerhouse in the lore. Do we just do the DBZ thing and we just go up and up and up and up and up until it becomes absolutely wacky and we lose the roots of what made this story and these characters so compelling to begin with? Well, I think the direction you go for this next narrative arc, I think that's the one they're likely doing right now, because that's the seeds they are sowing. And that is a deeply personal, introspective tale about the Warrior of Light and Azim. The idea that the Warrior of Light is now largely just a solo wanderer, that has so much potential, because in my opinion, that's the direction you go. That's the direction you lean into. Some of my favorite moments in all of Final Fantasy XIV have been when the Warrior of Light is at the center of the stage and they're actively a character in that moment. The speech Xenos gives to you at the end of Stormblood 4.0. Or Girianje apologizing to you before you set off for the Tempest at the end of Shadowbringers. When you as a character decide you're not going to drag everyone down with you, you're going to go to Emmett Silk alone. And they had to convince you to let them tag along. The story, in my opinion, at this point in time, needs more emphasis on storytelling of that kind. This idea, this notion that Dawntrail was trying to do of developing other characters and having them kind of be the protagonist and just letting us be essentially the glorified cameraman, I don't like it. Some people might, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I don't want it to come off as if I'm right, you're wrong. Because again, what we're talking about before, storytelling and our perception and reception of storytelling is inherently subjective. But, at least in my eyes, that kind of storytelling doesn't work in an MMORPG where we have so many hours invested. And I'm talking into the future here. I don't think you can just completely shift storytelling over to having the Warrior of Light be a cameraman because we have so many hours invested with our character. We have so many hours invested with our Warrior of Light. I I at least want to be a character. I want more agency. I want the Warrior of Light to feel like an intrinsic part of this story, and I want them to have a story all of their own. It's one of the reasons I loved Elpis so much. I think the direction they take now is that Dawntrail was planting the seeds so that those seeds can be nurtured and fertilized in the future to tell a story about Azim and the Warrior of Light, and I think that's a direction they should take, because that doesn't necessarily require a world-ending threat to have interesting and compelling antagonists, but a deeply emotional, introspective journey of self-discovery, not only of Azim but for the Warrior of Light, kind of in the style of the Dark Knight quests of years gone by. I think that could work, but I don't blame people for not seeing it, because that's a complete and utter shift in storytelling style and presentation for what we were just presented with in Dawntrail, and likely will continue to for the next couple of patches as they wrap up the Dawntrail story in 7.2 and 7.3. But I don't think that the state of the world Final Fantasy XIV was left with at the end of Endwalker limits it in any meaningful way, because good writing wouldn't be limited by it. It would use it as a jumping off point for even cooler and more engrossing storytelling. And I don't think wiping the slate clean and burning it all down to start again would address the root issues that Final Fantasy XIV has right now in terms of design, direction, and philosophy. We have to wait and see, but I have hope, because they have been teasing that things going into the future will be far more interesting and engrossing if you can weed out the details and the little kernels of foreshadowing they've been trying to lay into the story of Dawntrail in 7.1. And with that, I think I'll call the video day for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, your opinions on where the story of Final Fantasy XIV is going into the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, and to hear your perspectives. And also, if you have a hot take of your own, leave it down below. I'd love to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, I'll react to it in a future video. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again!